Welcome to Chapter 3 in Sociology 101. This is the chapter on culture. So, by the way, I think you know this, but I'll just feel better if I say it anyway. We do not mean holding your pinky out when you are when you're when you're drinking your tea, right? So we're not talking about that kind of culture. We're talking about the things that we think are important enough to pass on from one generation to the next. A lot of what we pass on in culture aren't even things that we necessarily spend all that much time thinking about because they seem normal, right? So culture are those things that are normal for us to pass on to the next generation. And they're things that we do, they're things that we say. So that's kind of how culture works, right? It's those things that are important, the values within a culture, the rules within a culture. It's culture is one of the things that holds us together because it gives us rules to follow. It gives us at least guardrails to stay between, and it does give us values and things that are important. Society, on the other hand, are think more geographically, but a society is the interrelationships within a group where there's obviously culture there as well that are tying people together. But again, with a society, we're more talking about a geographic location. In this chapter, one of the things we want to do is we want to compare different eras, right? So most of us, well, all of us, our ancestors at one point or another were hunters and gatherers, right? So within those particular societies, how did it work? Well, I mean, some of the things that we know, if we're constantly on the move, we're essentially scaring away more food than we're actually catching. So we wouldn't have taken a lot with us, right? So you wouldn't put a baby grand piano on your back. You would do other things. Look, one of the things that's always been interesting to me is in some hunting and gathering societies, people used tattoos and piercings thousands of years ago as ways to show power within a society where people ranked hierarchically within society or maybe just for fashion. Now, 5,000 years ago, people didn't have sterile needles and gloves and those sorts of things, right? So it's interesting for me to think that, then your scalpel, would have been a sharp rock and you would have used some kind of flint. So you make a cut into the skin, you put something dark like slate or flint in there, and then you pack it with herbs that you think aren't going to cause an infection. And if you don't get an infection and if you don't die, congratulations, you have a tattoo. So all these years later, we're probably a little better when it comes to safety protocols on this stuff, but in a weird way, not all that different. So let me also say this. The difference between people on top of a society and on bottom of a society that were hunters and gatherers, there weren't a whole lot of possessions that would have differentiated that. So the difference would have been very small, right? These are people constantly on the move. And again, they're in terms of inequality, not as much as what we have today. One of the questions that we need to answer in a sociology class is how much of who we are is based on genetics and how much of who we are is based on socialization. This is a sociology class, so I think you can gather you're going to hear a lot about socialization. This week, however, that's our topic for chapter 4. This week, however, our focus is really going to be on biology, right? On the genetic part of this. So one of the things to think about is sociobiology. Sociobiology really means, the link between biology and socialization. So for example, dry today. So for example, one of the things that we know to be true is that alcoholism tends to run in families. Addiction issues tend to run in families. And that always begs the question, chicken or the egg, right? I mean, how is that because of the culture within that family? Is that because of genetics? Well, now we know that it's probably a link between those two. And so, what some people are born with is a genetic marker for addiction. Now, if you have a genetic marker for addiction, it doesn't mean you're going to become an alcoholic. It doesn't mean you're going to become addicted to anything. It simply means your chances of becoming addicted are higher than others. And so you may have friends who have addiction issues, and you may have wondered in the past, why, we've attended a lot of the same parties, we've tried a lot of the same things. Why does this person seem to have addiction issues and the rest of us do not? Well, it very well could, I mean, I don't know if it is, but it very well could come back to this particular marker, right? So, and we've seen this. We've seen this in breast cancer and prostate cancer with the BRCA gene, right? And by the way, there is a link between the same gene. Unfortunately, it was responsible for an awful lot of cancer in both men and women. But it doesn't always mean that that is going to, is going to go in that direction. Sometimes lifestyle choices impact that as well. I work in education for men with prostate cancer, and one of the things we talk a lot about is diet and exercise, right? And so encouraging people to cut out fatty foods and eat more lean proteins and vegetables and all those kinds of things, which are probably things that are going to help you live longer anyway. So, but when we're having conversations about sociobiology, this is where it can be really helpful. So one of the questions is, how do nature and nurture interact? Well, let's think about this for a moment. How many times in your life have you taken an IQ test? So if you grew up in this country, the answer should be many. So if you took every year at school the Iowa, the Kansas City, the Minnesota, the California, whatever it was your school used, those are all derivatives of an IQ test. If you've taken the ACT or the SAT, those are derivatives of an IQ test. Many of you are going to take the GRE or the LSAT someday. Again, derivatives of an IQ test. This country is just in love with IQ testing. This is controversial. We've seen more and more schools try to walk away from things like SAT scores and ACT scores. But boy, it's just so easy to look at a number and make an admission decision, right? So it takes an awful lot of pressure off of an awful lot of people. So I think we're kind of finding we need to go in a different direction, but it's not going to be easy to get there. So well over 100 years ago in Paris, France, we had a gentleman in psychology by the name of Alfred Binet, and Binet was studying. This is before we knew that parts of the brain were responsible for different functions. And he believed that if someone was having an hysterical fit, I mean, they've just absolutely lost it, right? There's spittle and they've just lost it. He believed that if you waved a giant magnet over the person's head, that it would take the chemicals in the brain that were in the wrong spot and it would put them in the correct spot and the person would calm down. So think Elephant Man. He and a colleague would go from town to town and they would demonstrate this. So think about it. Your fellow townspeople have identified you as the person in town most prone to hysterical fits. They take you up on a stage, they put you in a chair, and they rope you to it. Now's probably a pretty good time to have an hysterical fit. What we know now in the behavioral sciences is that when someone is having this kind of episode, they're trying to communicate something. Probably get me the heck out of this chair, right? But they're trying to communicate something. They're not choosing an appropriate means of that communication. However, they are trying to communicate. So at some point, Binet was kind of laughed at a little bit, right? People said, wait a second, we know it's not the magnet. So good news for us, bad news for his children, because here's what he did. He went home and he tested the living daylights out of his kids, right? He became enthralled with the concept of mental age, which is the precursor to IQ. He wanted to know, what does the average 4-year-old know? What does the average 5-year-old know? And so his idea was that if you're 4, but you know what the average 5 or 6-year-old knows, then you have a higher IQ. So your mental age is higher than your chronological age. Conversely, if you know less than other people your age, you have a lower mental age than your chronological age. So about 120 years ago or so in Paris, they were identifying students in school who were not learning to read and write the way everyone else did. And so this was the dawn of special education. And people said, well, here's what we need. We need a special school, right? We'll have special teachers for the special students. And they were trying to come up with a way, how does one identify who would benefit from the special school? And I mean, you couldn't really go to the teachers and say, would you identify the students in your class who would benefit? Because what if one teacher has different standards or has different methodology for this? So they went to Benet and they said, hey, we hear that you've been putting together a mental age test. We want to use it. And so they started using what we refer to now as IQ testing to identify students who would go to the special school. We continue to do this to this day here in the United States. When Benet's mental age test was translated from French to English, it was done, this was performed at Stanford University. I just absolutely love this story. So it was immediately referred to as the Stanford Binet. That's just, that's a good job of marketing, getting the Stanford name in there. So the Stanford Binet is still with us. The Slauson is probably a more common test for people to use. But again, we've seen an awful lot of the testing in this country. The reason I said all of that is to ask you this question. So if we were to study identical twins, right, for our nursing students in the class, monozygote, meaning identical twins come from one egg, so they are genetic duplicates of each other. If we were to study them, how would we study them and compare that to IQ? And just to jump ahead, since we're not in the same class together, or the same room, I should say, together, they decided to study, University of Minnesota, decided to study identical twins separated at birth, right? And they did, again, University of Minnesota has just done a preeminent job on studying identical twins. If you're looking for a paper topic, identical twins are just a great, there's so much information that's out there. A set of twins you're always going to hear about are going to be the Jim twins. And they were both probably in their 40s when they were connected to the project. Neither knew they had an identical twin, so there goes that theory out the window. But anyway, they were both named Jim. They both grew up in small towns in Ohio. Names are so interesting when you study identical twins. They had nothing to do with their names being Jim, but they both, and I may have this backwards, but you'll get the point, they both married a woman named Linda, divorced her, and married a woman named Betty. How interesting is that? Have you ever thought about your future spouse might in part be chosen because of a name? Anyway, interesting to think about. They both had a son named James Allen. The only difference was the spelling of the name Allen. And there were many other things. They both chain smoked the same cigarette. They both loved NASCAR and hated baseball. They both vacationed at the same fishing resort on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Don't you? And they were both sheriff's deputies. Don't you think the owner of the resort thought the same guy was coming down twice a year? His name's Jim. He looks exactly like the other Jim, so they probably just thought he was the same guy. But the one that's always gotten me, many of you someday are going to purchase new construction when you purchase a home. And I mean, the advantage to new construction is it's no one else has lived there. Any mistakes are yours. So congratulations with that. But when you buy new construction, you get sod in the front, and then you get essentially bird seed in the back, and you'll have weeds for a couple years. But they give you one tree in the front yard on the street side. And both of the Jim twins built a circular bench around the tree and painted it white. I mean, just what are the odds of that? So it brings us to the question: how much of who we are is based on genetics? And so if the question is how much of our IQ is based on genetics, the answer seems to be quite a bit. What we're going to focus on in chapter 4 is a completely different scenario. We're going to focus on children. We're going to start with an example of children that were abused and neglected. Then you can take all the genetics and just throw it out the window, right? It just doesn't matter anymore. Abuse and neglect negates all of that. So, how much of our IQ is based on genetics? Quite a bit. But there are other things that factor into that as well. Okay. One of the things on the exam I want you to be able to differentiate between, and this is how people come into a country, so say the United States. So we're going to compare and contrast assimilation and multiculturalism. Assimilation is simple, right? Assimilation means that the immigrant group or the new group forsakes or gives up their previous culture and they embrace the new culture. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. An example of this, I'm sure you've heard someone say this before, whether on television, in a bar or a coffee shop, and you've heard someone say, hey, and I love it when they say it this way: if you're going to live in this country, you need to speak American, right? Because there is no language that's American. If there were, it'd be Spanish. But anyway, so when someone says that, they are asking the people who are immigrants to assimilate. And part of assimilating is giving up your previous culture, your previous language, and here's one: your previous religion, right? When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, it was a huge deal because he was the first Catholic president. And so there were people who were very concerned, and they thought that he would essentially have a bat phone, right? And it would be a phone to the Pope. And anytime he had a difficult decision, he would call the Pope, and the Pope would run the country. And if they knew anything about John F. Kennedy's personal life, they wouldn't have had any of those concerns. But it's politics, so people exaggerate. But that was the fear. And so it was a big deal that he was Catholic. And so, look, when Catholic immigrants, particularly from Ireland, first starting and Italy, first started coming into the US, sometimes they hid it, right? So, oftentimes, if people do assimilate, then what we'll see is they'll assimilate Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And then evenings and weekends, they'll practice their family and historical rituals, whether it's family gatherings, holidays, religion, those types of things. So even in assimilation, it's usually just Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Multiculturalism is slightly different. Well, it's completely different. So in multiculturalism, there's not a memo that's sent out, but there's an understanding that the immigrant group in question, they've kind of made it, right? They've kind of fit in. I mean, some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some of them are successful, some of them are in prison. So there's no memo that's sent out, but they've kind of made it. And so people start to say things like, yeah, they're different, but they're okay, right? So that's what multiculturalism is. So recognizing there's a difference, but being tolerant of that. We need more tolerance in today's society, by the way. Last thing on that, I just saw Salad Bowl. When I was very young, I grew up with the melting pot theory, which, if you're looking for a Chicago tie, actually comes from the University of Chicago. The melting pot idea was you take all these different races and colors and ethnicities and you put them into a large cauldron and you just mix it up. And then at the end of the day, there's whatever is left, whatever. And now we say, yeah, it doesn't really work like that because people retain elements of their culture and ethnicity. So now we say salad bowl. I don't know why we feel like we have to have food analogies here, But a salad bowl is, you throw a bunch of different vegetables into a bowl, and you're still going to have some different colors. You're going to have some reds and some greens and some yellows and some oranges. So it's still a salad, but some groups are retaining part of their heritage, right? So we say salad bowl today. I don't know what it's going to be 10 years from now, but it'll probably be another another food example. On the exam, I want you to differentiate between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism is a knee jerk. It's so easy to do. What ethnocentrism means is that we judge another culture based on our standards. So you base another culture based on your standards. And people do this all the time, right? They say, why do they, right? Why do they fill in the blank? Well, I'll tell you what happens when you do that. The other group's looking back at you thinking the same thing, right? Why do, while you're thinking, why do they do that? They're thinking, why do you do that? So anyway, it's kind of a vicious circle with that. Cultural relativism is difficult. And the reason cultural relativism is difficult is because you're potentially judging another culture based on their standards. And it's difficult to know another group's standards, and it's difficult to embrace those standards because, again, this is a chapter on culture. The things that are normal to us are the things that have been passed down. No matter how crazy you think your life has been so far, when you look at other things, you compare those things to your experiences. So no matter how crazy you think your family is, you compare other families to yours. Yours, in a weird way, becomes the norm, if you will. That's why ethnocentrism is so easy. We don't want people to do it, but that's why it's so easy. And it's also why cultural relativism is so hard, because it's not our knee jerk. It's not our knee jerk to reflect on another culture using their methods, using their goals as a way of judgment. So, anyway, those are two very different things. There are some things that are universals. All societies have language. All societies have a way of communicating with each other. All societies have a way of rearing the children. So marriage and family in one society may look very different from marriage and how to rear children in another society. Uh, all societies laugh, all societies have music and dance, and all societies have a prohibition against incest, right? So there's a lot of things that are universal, but each society kind of has its own take on it. Okay. So we talked a few minutes ago about hunting and gathering societies and about how there's very little difference between the people on the top and the people on the bottom. At one point, it's amazing to me that I can just click a button here, and you don't see it, but I'm moving through screens. When we were a pastoral society, that means you're raising farm animals to help you farm and also for food, right? Um, Maybe the harder one was agrarian society, where we were raising crops, and obviously we still do this to this day. We need to eat. Farming is hard, right? There's things you don't know, and you have to be so reliant on the weather. Do we know the weather? California, this is going to time date this, but California is going through brownouts right now, right? So it's just the weather can just be, you just don't know you don't know what it's going to do. So farming is difficult. And then who knew that planting the same crop in the same field every year took nutrients out of the soil? Who knew there were nutrients in the soil? And that your yield, how often do you get to say this, and that the yield of your crops would go down every year. So you need to grow other things in the same field and spread it around. So anyway, um, but it was hard. And if there's one famine, if there is one flood, if there is one time when there's no rain, then then what happens to that particular society, right? So, I mean, the Mayans that most of us, I think, or many of us studied at one point in middle school and in high school, right? There's still what happened to the Mayans, right? And even though they were in a tropical rainforest, the belief I've heard the most is that they went through a drought. So even though they're in the middle of a tropical rainforest, every few decades they would go through a drought, and so they just and you can see by some of the things, some of the water retention that they built, that they planned for that. But maybe they just reached a point where they planned for it, but they just didn't have enough water resources. Anyway, even smart people can run into trouble when you're completely reliant on farming or agrarian. Oh, I left out the most important part. So, with agrarian, with pastoral societies, one of the things that we see is the difference between the lives of the people on top and the people on bottom is the largest that we've ever seen. So, in Great Britain, for example, people who became landowners referred to themselves as lords, right? Wouldn't you like to meet the first person who came up with that, right? I own all of this land. I mean, I kind of want to meet that person because I think they're going to be a jerk. But somebody stood on a mountaintop somewhere and said, all of this land is mine, right? And I'm Lord. I know it's going to be a jerk, so I kind of want to meet that person. So you have someone who owns all kinds of stuff, and then everyone else is a peasant farmer, right? So honestly, you're either at the top of the food chain or you're at the very bottom. There was very little in between. There may have been some military, right? There may have been some other workers who would have been in between. But for the most part, it was a family or two ruled hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And so the difference between the people on top and the people on bottom was huge. Think of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, right? So you had people that had others convinced that they were tied to the gods, or I just had some ancient alien episodes run through my head. Oh my gosh! So, and then everyone else was a peasant farmer, right? So pharaohs lived like kings, and everyone else didn't, right? So when we talk about the difference between people on the top and people on the bottom, that's a great example of an agrarian society, right? Because there's no middle class. The creation of the middle class kind of changed everything, right? So manufacturing, when it came in, industrialization, when it came in, really created a large scale middle class. And so, what I mean by that, in agrarian societies, typically children gain their livelihood based on inheritance. Marriages would be arranged, right? Your parents would cut an economic deal with another family, and you would get married. You wouldn't have any say. I will say, when I got married years ago, I was talking with a colleague of mine, and he said to me, and he was from a country that continues to practice arranged marriage, and he said, in your country, meaning the United States, he said, in your country, you marry the person that you love. I said, I think that's right. He said, in my country, we grow to love the person that we marry. And that's very different. That's always stuck with me. It's just such a different take on love and marriage, right? So anyway, that's always stuck with me. So, so with industrialization, people were no longer reliant on their parents for their livelihood. They can move into the city, get a job at a factory, right? And then make their own way in the world. And so we've had this for several generations now. We're starting to see this, not starting, we've been seeing this going down for some time. 150 years ago, the United States was the cheapest group on the block, right? We had a lot of raw materials, particularly in the South. We had a lot of raw materials with cotton and other things. And so we had people coming here to build railroads, to transport things to the north. The ports were in New York and Boston, and so that's where the ports were, that's where the factories were. So when it came to textiles, when it came to clothing, we were suddenly the cheapest group on the block, right? And one of the things that we know about cotton is cotton requires a 200-day growing season. And what that means is you need to be guaranteed 200 consecutive days of summer. Just to bum you out, how many days of summer do you think we're guaranteed in Chicago? It's around 75. It's just a really low number. And I get sad every time I think of and say that. So when you think of the Mexican American War and Sam Houston marching into Mexico City and saying we want half of everything that there is to have, that war was entirely about land. That in the US was in debt. And back then, if you went to war, you could find your way out of debt. We figured out in Iraq and Afghanistan, it doesn't work that way anymore. But Sam Houston goes into Mexico City and says, we want half because the United States wanted Mexican land. So think of this for a moment. The US gains Texas, New Mexico, Utah, California, parts of Colorado. I'm probably leaving things out, but no Hollywood, um, right? No skiing in Aspen. I mean, no Dallas Cowboys in Texas. It would have been a very different country, right? So 150 years ago, the US was looking for land because we were growing like gangbusters, and this was a great opportunity to make money because we were the cheapest labor on the block because our factories were brand new and competing against Great Britain, whose factories were older and they paid people a lot more money. So the United States benefited from that. Now, 150 years later, this is just how it works. We're not the cheapest labor anymore, right? So a lot of the manufacturing has been shipped off to other places. And it's interesting that one of those places is Mexico, given the Mexican American War and why it was fought 150 years ago. So anyway, it's interesting when we study these things to see how everything fits in with each other. But with industrialization, people were able to leave home and make their own way in the world with the creation of the middle class. And I'll give you one other that's just amazing to think about. Prior to industrialization, children spent all their time with adults, right? The old stories of children should be seen and not heard. People weren't kidding about that stuff. With the onset of industrialization, it suddenly became important for your son or daughter to learn how to read and write and count. And education became very important, right? So it changed parenting because suddenly parents started to think of their children and how they could help their children prepare for a better life. Here's the part that might make more sense to you right now. When you put a bunch of teenagers in the same room together, people are going to get crushes on each other. So the whole concept of dating or courting or whatever they called it back then was really a result, the way we think of dating was really a result of industrialization, because for the first time, young people spent more time with young people in school. Now, this remote learning is throwing a wrench into that. Sorry about that. We do have online dating. I don't know how that works during COVID, but anyway, you get my point. I'm trying to be funny and I'm not. But industrialization changed the workforce, it changed relationship with parents, it changed relationship between young people and other young people. When I hate it when people say, and this changed everything, because usually 99% of the time when someone says that, it isn't true. This time it is. Industrialization did change everything. So now 150 years later, now we have strip malls, right? And in strip malls, you have the same stores in all of them. And now there's almost always a couple stores that are vacant. But there's going to be, Now we're going to have a corner store that's a CVS or a Walgreens or something like that. There's going to be a dry cleaner. There's going to be a Chinese takeout. There's going to be a pizza delivery, right? I mean, those are the kinds of stores. How many people in those stores are making good money and working full-time with benefits? Almost no one. Almost no one. And so one of the things that we've seen is we've seen good paying union manufacturing jobs go away, and we've seen those replaced with part-time minimum wage jobs with no benefits. And so that's been changing our economy. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons you're in college right now is, right? I don't think you want to make minimum wage. You probably want a career. I think you likely do want a career. Education's the best way to get there. But choose a career, choose a major that's going to help you get a career, right? Choose something that there's actually going to be demand for when you graduate. We'll talk about that more as the semester goes on. Colonialism. It's hard to have this conversation without talking about colonialism. Great Britain, Spain, the United States have been countries that have gone around the globe, kind of taken over some places, right? I mean, I just gave you the example of the United States and Mexico. Great Britain expanded around the globe. We're really seeing those changes now affecting themselves in India. One of the things that we notice is that in pockets of India, there's a lot more education, there's a lot more jobs. As a matter of fact, we've seen a lot of call center jobs in the US be exported to India because people from India oftentimes speak the Queen's English, right? So they speak better English than I do. So this has been positive. One of the downsides for India, I don't know if this quite qualifies as a downside. I'll let you decide that. But what many people from India have done is they've come to the United States and gotten a degree. And the original intent may have been then to go back home and build something. And many people now are deciding, you know what, I can make pretty good money in the United States, so I think I'm going to stay. So India has some things to figure out there. But if you want to know why that it's taken India until the last couple decades to really see this kind of growth, it's because they were under colonial control. When you're under colonial control, you don't have control over your economy. You're relying on someone else. And as a matter of fact, your role is not for you to get better. Your role is for you to support the queen, right? To support royalty. And so once that starts to go away, then people are able to make decisions for themselves. Last thing I want to say, and your generation gets this better than any other generation has, the internet and global culture, right? I mean, when it comes to purchasing things, when it comes to interacting with others, you may have had classes in school where you interacted with a classroom from another country. Um, One of the things, and we're really seeing this play out politically, but the whole concept of what nationalism means, the whole concept of what globalism means, and is there a merging of those things, and do you have to put a flag in the ground on one and forsake the other? And so these are really difficult conversations for people right now because oftentimes they're two very different perspectives. But these are issues that are going to they're not going away, right? They're absolutely not going away. It's great to see new parts of the world um, become involved in technology and industrialization, and in turn improve the lives of the people who live there. So this is something that's going to be a lot of fun to watch going forward. Next time in chapter 4, we're going to have more of a conversation on how society impacts how much of who we are is based on genetics and how much of who we are is based on socialization. I hope you have a tremendous day.